Hello, welcome everybody to the latest Meridian West 30-minute webinar. Today we're going to be looking at a really interesting topic, how we use data to elevate the impact of thought leadership, and in particular thinking about three key phases during any thought leadership project or campaign where taking decisions around data, I think, is really integral. This is a great follow-on from the session we had a couple of weeks ago around how to choose the best topics for thought leadership. So if you haven't seen that, it is available on the Meridian West YouTube channel. So would encourage everybody to take a look at that one as well. Joining me to chew the fat on data and thought leadership today, delighted to say that I'm joined by Bertie Heppel and John Mulligan, both Associate Directors here at Meridian West, and Ben Kent, who is Founder Director as well. So as I said, we're going to look, I think, at data around kind of three areas, why it's important in terms of creating thought leadership in the first place, how you can then use it in terms of analytics, and then thirdly, around the activation stage of thought leadership itself. So maybe let's dive in around kind of data and thought leadership. We talked a couple of weeks ago, Ben, around finding good topics. So let's assume that's our starting point. We've got a great topic. Yeah. But why would we kind of invest in taking a data-led approach rather than just producing, for example, a thought piece or an opinion piece from one of our firm's subject matter experts?
Well, I think that's a data approach is kind of critical in terms of kind of giving it robustness, because I think particularly in this of the era of kind of AI generated content, people are looking for something that kind of is based on kind of robust evidence rather than recycled insights. I think that's number one. I think number two, it's pretty much essential if you want to use the thought leadership to gain coverage, press coverage. They tend to want stats rather than just quotes or case studies. And I think thirdly, it gives you much more kind of scope for really diving into data and maybe kind of doing segmentation or slicing and dicing the data. So you get much more kind of return on investment, because from one survey, you can slice and dice and look at it across different industry sectors or different countries. So I think those are the three main reasons.
Fantastic. So I think we'll come into some of those in a bit more detail shortly, but Bertie, just to turn to you, because I know when we were speaking earlier about this, you were saying that actually some of the research you've been doing, particularly around measuring the impact of professional services brands, actually shows that, data-driven thought leadership can play a real big difference there. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a fair amount of brand trackers and other similar projects for large professional services firms, law firms, accounting firms, and what we find actually across all of the brand trackers I certainly work on, what we find is that there's a consistency around buyers of professional services really valuing, more than any other kind of material, research-led thought leadership. It's all, secondary to that is really anything that can demonstrate expertise in a kind of concrete fashion. So what we see through that is that thought leadership is kind of data-driven thought leadership is much more effective at targeting buyers than your kind of standard insight piece or technical update, which doesn't have the same level of kind of robustness behind it.
Yep. And we've been banding the data around quite a lot in the first 4 or 5 minutes of this conversation here. Maybe John, help us kind of pick that apart a little bit. When we talk about data, what kind of things are we talking about here? Is it just kind of surveys, or what else helps to generate thought leadership?
I think survey data is the foundation, is the starting point, and that can be a mix of both quant data and qual data. It doesn't have to be just numbers. It also can have sort of verbatim comments as well. I think just building on a couple of the things the other people have said as well, I think one of the things that data-led approach also helps us do is repeatability. It contributes to being able to do trend reporting, which can be quite exciting to see tracking opinion and how that changes over time. We're doing some work with an accountancy firm, for example, who are doing an economic barometer of opinion across SMEs. It's quite an interesting, gives lots of scope to rotate questions over time. So in terms of the types of data, you've got that survey, you've got the survey data as a foundation, which you can obviously repeat. But there's also, you can move out to desk research as well, evaluation of third-party sources, and then also there's a case study type approach as well, which leans more heavily on in-depth interviews with, and that's particularly useful if you've got a very senior audience in mind.
It's interesting. And Ben, what's your reflection on those different types that John was talking about there? Are they, you know, do they lend themselves to different types of thought leadership or different topics, do you think?
Yes, I think, you know, the qual survey data and the desk research, I think campaigns often have a kind of combination of all three. I think the best ones actually combine all three, but I think they each have their strengths. I think desk research can be quite good, particularly if your budget's limited. But, you know, because there's lots of data out there, but I think you really need to be creative about what's your distinctive lens on that data. And I think actually AI is really helpful here, because we're increasingly using AI to analyze desk research. I think we've discussed, you know, quant data is very good for benchmarking, creating maturity curves, segmentation. And I think the more qualitative approach is really, if you want that kind of depth of insight, maybe there's a few individual experts, you really want their views, or you want to create a series of case studies. So we did a really interesting piece with KPMG on disruptive philanthropists, and we use in-depth interviews to create really quite compelling kind of case studies of what each of those philanthropists are doing. So qual works well for that.
Interesting. And certainly I would agree with that. I think, you know, the kind of really impactful campaigns that I've worked on do blend those different approaches. So certainly where you've got the ability to draw on a robust data set, and I think increasingly when we're talking about campaigns that are multi-sector, multi-jurisdictional, you were talking, Ben, about, you know, getting media attention. Actually, in those cases, I think, you know, the media wants to know, is this based on, you know, 500, 1,000 plus kind of views, you know, that it's got some real weight behind it, but then also telling the stories from that. And those case studies are a great way of bringing some of that to life.
Exactly.
So let's dive into this idea of kind of, you know, we're taking a data-led approach, but there's quite a lot of things that we can do with that in terms of analytics, particularly if we're collecting large volumes of data to support our thought leadership. So, Bertie, I know one of the things that you've looked at in a range of projects is how you can create different models, whether that's based on, you know, maturity or segmenting data in different ways. Tell us a little bit about, you know, what you've seen to be most effective there.
Yeah, I think this is really what puts the narrative behind the data, as it were, and really kind of, you know, brings out an action for someone who's actually reading the report to take, rather than, okay, that's very interesting, 80% of people think this. So I suppose one kind of particularly useful example that we've been employing in a project actually very recently is the use of cluster analysis to segment respondents into different categories. So you know, what you can do with this is kind of create personas, so types of organization for whom the takeaway and the kind of the key message, the action that they need to take, it will be slightly different, and that adds, I think, a layer of adds personality to the data, so it makes it a much more engaging read, but it also adds that kind of, you know, takeaway, that okay, what do I do as a result of this, which I think is a great way to kind of action the results.
Yep. And I know you've been working on something which is going to be published very soon, but, you know, could you maybe just give a flavor of the, you know, the kind of examples that you're talking about there, what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, so in that particular example, it's looking at it's looking at the relationship between kind of business outcomes and employee engagement, and by segmenting into kind of 3 different categories, we can say, okay, here's a category who are kind of performing very well on one side, or not as well on the other side, and here's the kind of reverse image category, and then there's a third category, which are the ones who are kind of leading in both areas. And this allows us to really say kind of drill down and pinpoint onto what the kind of takeaway actions are for one particular category over another. It's it makes the report and the final kind of outcome a lot more applicable to a wider audience in that fashion.
Yeah. And I think that theme of relevance, I think, is particularly pertinent. I know we'll perhaps touch on that a little bit later when we talk about activation, but I think increasingly that's what we're seeing, that people are only going to spend time engaging with content if they really see that immediate relevance. So I definitely think that kind of analysis definitely lends itself to more of that. John, I know this is an area that you've had quite a lot of experience in as well. What are your reflections on, what Bertie was saying there in terms of using some of these techniques like clustering or creating different models, how they work and what you've seen effective there?
I think these models add a greater sophistication to the analysis, greater nuance, because at its simplest level, just cutting the data by sector or country is a form of segmentation. But by using a technique like cluster analysis, you can take in multiple different variables to identify a data-driven story that's not necessarily obvious. So the example that kind of springs to mind is one where we found with a survey of SMEs where it looked on the surface like the kind of optimism, pessimism of economic conditions was based on company size, but by using something like cluster analysis, we were able to identify that actually underneath that picture is one of a story of growth, and that was actually driving the driving sentiment. And I think that being able to pull together multiple different variables from within your survey, different data points, adds that nuance and sophistication.
Interesting. So it's almost just going beyond just looking at the obvious to actually find something that might not be hidden, or maybe hidden on first sight, but actually, by applying some of these techniques, it helps you tell a clearer story.
Mm.
I think one of the other benefits of that kind of approach is then it gives you, as a producer of this content, some IP, so if you like. So, we were working with, this is a few years old, this project, but working with one of the big four on a project around next generation family business leaders. And one of the things that we came up with through the analysis there was 4 different types of leader. And again, that was based on a analysis of the data, but that's a model that they've continued to use, and they've used that in a range of their outputs, but it's also kind of theirs. It's their language that they can use, but it's backed up by the research. Ben, you're kind of nodding along there. What are your experiences of some of these different types of data analysis techniques?
I think I'm a great fan, to be honest, because I think, inevitably there's quite a lot of cost involved in getting the interviews, getting interviews with senior decision makers around the world. But I think these tools can really enhance the kind of the ROI of them. It kind of finds insights that will cut through the kind of noise. But I think particularly now there's a much more greater emphasis on how do we use thought leadership as a BD tool. So what we're increasingly doing is create a survey, and then out of that you can then essentially, so we've just done one on client feedback and how sophisticated client feedback programs are. We then scored firms based on 5 dimensions, and then depending on the score, we could then say, are they a leader, in the middle of the pack, or they're just starting out? And then that actually, you can then sit down with the client and say, okay, well, you're in the middle of the pack, but if you change these things, X, Y, Z, then you could be a leader. Actually, it moves it from just being a kind of fairly generic thought leadership report to actually a really useful planning tool. And it goes beyond being a thought leadership tool. It's almost like a kind of project scoping tool. and really adds value to the client. So yeah, I think all the technologies kind of exist. It's just applying it with some creativity.
Yes, and I think that that kind of maturity approach, benchmarking people against their peers, I think is a great way of, again, telling a story that might not be immediately obvious just looking at the headline data. And it reminds me of some of you on the webinar may have seen last year our case study webinar with JLL, where they were talking about some of the work we'd done with them. And again, applying a similar type of approach to segmenting real estate decision makers by maturity. And I know, Bertie, that was a project you were involved in. Any kind of reflections on lessons learned from that particular project?
Yeah, I think it when you have, and again, it depends on the kind of narrative that you're drawing out from the data. If it is a case of a progression to a goal, as it were, there's a kind of there's a group of starters, there's a group of kind of more mature mature kind of organizations within the segment. I think what you begin to by creating that segmentation, what you begin to be able to kind of bring out is a very, very future forward, future looking kind of reports, kind of output. And I suppose there's a couple of things from that particular example. There's a couple of benefits that has. I think first off, it's much more engaging for the kind of the client base. Everyone wants to know, everyone wants to be kind of scanning the horizons and looking out for what's out there. I think it's also agenda setting in a way that kind of other pieces are not. And I think it has a lot more staying power than something that doesn't look to kind of address future trends in the same way. And I think really, there's a lot that went into that from the way that we designed the research to begin with, but certainly the maturity model that we put in place for that was a big part of what's kind of enabled all that.
Yeah, and that's a great point actually, because I think actually a lot of these more advanced techniques that we've been talking about do depend on you designing with that in mind. It's quite hard to retrofit often, if you haven't thought about this during the planning phase. Could we have changed the kind of questions to create a maturity model? It's very hard to backfill that. So it does have to be something you want to think about upfront, definitely.
Exactly. And I think having your subject matter experts helping in design what that maturity curve looks like, because essentially you need to define what good looks like. So we did a project, it's in the public domain, with Alan Overy looking at innovation within legal departments. So we're very fortunate we had one of the leading lights within A&O who could share his thoughts on what scoring mechanism we use to define sophistication in legal department innovation, and then designing the questions, the scoring mechanism sitting behind that. So it's a kind of combination of researchers plus the subject matter experts.
And in these kind of examples, the JLL, Alan Overy, and others that we've been talking about, it also highlights one of the things that you were saying before, Ben, about that blurring between thought leadership and the kind of BD sales cycle. Actually, this content becomes part of an initial conversation with clients, whether it's existing clients in account management or potential sales opportunities. Can you say a little bit, Ben, perhaps about how to put some of that into practice? I'm thinking in particular of things like individual benchmarking reports and taking a data-driven approach in that way.
Yeah, so I think so the way we've worked is you do the initial sort of survey, got a good base size, so you've got something to compare against. But thereafter, what you can do is you can keep the sort of diagnostic open, and so you can use it as part of the the scoping stage with the client. So let's take innovation in legal department. So Alan Overy could sit down, say, okay, we've got this diagnostic, we're going to meet up with you. Could you initially do this 15-minute survey, and then what we'll do is then we'll sit down with our experts and we'll decide on what the shape of that engagement is and how we can help them. Is it a people issue? Is it a technology issue? Is it a governance issue? So I think that's quite exciting. It's thought leadership almost being used by the professionals in their engagements.
Absolutely. And I know, kind of switching focus a little bit, one of the other ways that I think you can, or firms can extract a lot of value from the data is actually making it, available to people either within the firm or externally, even to to interrogate and use. And I know, John, you've had quite a lot of experience with firms doing that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen there, and what tends to work quite well?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is this move to much more responsive, dynamic presentation of results, and that allows it to be used very flexibly. So that's using things like public-facing dashboards, also using the same technique internally, using internal dashboards. So we have one of our clients have actually did a multi-tier approach to developing their benchmark. They first launched a survey that helped then to work out, from the help of their community, from the people taking part, to design what good looked like. They then take that benchmark and use that directly with sales meetings to have and use their sales teams to actually run through a bespoke benchmarking survey with prospects, with clients, and compare them to the wider community. And that's been very effective. They've generated really interesting, high profile sales conversations. And then the second approach is the public facing dashboard, which another one of our clients is put out there. Assets, an accountancy firm based in UK, Ireland, and the Nordic region. And what that has been able to allow them to do is move to from a kind of a static approach, kind of traditional approach, to a very flexible, responsive one, which is a mix of multi survey points throughout the year. The data updates after every wave. It allows them to pick rotating topics and be quite agenda setting in terms of the thought leadership topics that they pick and present to the public. And thinking back to the segmentation conversation, segmentation works in a number of ways. Obviously, they're helping take the story, but also segment the results. And so one of the ways they've been able to utilize the flexibility of the dynamic dashboard is by having using just filters, create bespoke versions of the results for each of their markets, and allow their marketing teams to really tailor results to their audience.
Yeah, fantastic. Just as a reminder, in the last 5 minutes or so, if people have got any questions or any thing they want to ask the panel here, do put them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them before we wrap up. Just pick up on what you were saying there, John. Actually, I think I think one of the big trends certainly that we've seen and really tried to encourage, I think, over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, is really trying to squeeze as much value from, when you're collecting that data as possible, being able to cut it. Yes, the advanced segmentation is great, but even just looking at, what is the story for different regions, what's the story for different individual markets, different sectors, and actually having something which is very tailored. And I know, a number of the big kind of flagship publications from, the large consultancies, the big four, do that pretty well. They'll take a global topic that has relevance, but then they'll say, look, as part of our sample, we've interviewed, 100 decision makers within automotive or 100 decision makers within pharmaceuticals, and we can tell, a global narrative, but we can also tell a narrative or a story which is a little bit more specific or tailored. So, I think there's lots that you can do, and certainly the technology, as you've been describing, John, helps you to do that, pretty quickly, pretty efficiently. Ben, I wonder, any other thoughts in terms of, activating thought leadership, doing that, using data in different ways?
Yeah, I think, obviously AI, I think could be super transformative. So we've developed this tool called Meridian AI, which analyzes kind of interviews, but in fact any kind of conversation. So I think that could be used in 2 ways in thought leadership. One is if you're doing an event, say a conference, what you can do with this tool is you record the sessions, and then what it does is it summarizes each of the sessions, and it has a feature called query the data. And so what you can do is, if you've listened to all these things, you say, oh, I got a question, I know Alistair said something really interesting about that. You can just type in and it will come out, with your insight. So you can go kind of reuse the insight from that kind of conference. And I think it should be super helpful if people after a conference say, oh yeah, there was a really interesting piece. So I think that's one area. And the second area is, using AI to be another way, taking existing research and then having an AI interface on it, so people can just ask it direct questions. So what's the best way of doing X, Y, Z? You just ask it, and it's based on your research, but it answers very specifically your question. It's kind of the ultimate in personalization, if you like.
Absolutely. And just on the point about I guess engaging different audiences, one audience that I suspect many of the people on the webinar will be kind of dealing with day to day is those internal subject matter experts. We've already talked about giving them the opportunity to help kind of shape some of the modeling or shape the research design. But when it comes to actually giving them access to data, giving them these things that we've been talking about, Ben, any views on the kind of pros and cons of giving people, subject matter experts, direct access to data, or should we be taking perhaps a more considered approach to how that's managed?
I think you need to be pragmatic on these things. I think there will be kind of probably 5 or 6 people, who will be super users of these dashboards, who will interrogate the data. I think the typical partner there is quite busy and is not that tech savvy. So I think you're much better off using the dashboard. You can then pull out the insight you want, pop it into a PowerPoint, give it to the partner. It's probably more effective than asking them to log into a dashboard.
Yeah. So actually having control with a kind of small core project team, maybe a couple of your key subject matter experts have access to that, but the kind of the wider team or wider partnership, you're kind of drip feeding or spoon feeding them on demand or as they need it.
Exactly. You can control the messaging as well.
Yeah. Good point, actually, because I think a lot of the effectiveness of this thought leadership does depend on a kind of clear messaging that doesn't get kind of watered down when everybody gets their hands on it. Absolutely. Exactly. So I guess just in the last few minutes, Bertie, any kind of final thoughts from you in terms of activating thought leadership? What you'd encourage people on the call to do as a kind of takeaway?
We've spoken about kind of dashboarding. We've spoken about the way that you personalize the output and you make it kind of bespoke. I suppose the kind of strength of this that I would point out is that yes, you've got the kind of the final perfect report, whatever it is, you post it on LinkedIn, it gets a lot of engagement, and you boost awareness for the firm or even the kind of sector service line as a whole. But I think really kind of getting the best return on investment in this is that kind of using it to open doors, have those conversations. It's kind of I suppose it's the difference between kind of marketing and business development in a way. It's enabling or empowering both fee owners and business development people to have those kind of conversations that move potential buyers just that bit further down the funnel from yes, I'm aware of the firm's kind of expertise in this area, to okay, they're actually a kind of a consideration in my mind.
Fantastic. So that's 30 minutes done. Thanks, Ben, Bertie, Jonathan. We've taken a huge kind of topic and hopefully made it digestible for everybody today. Just a quick reminder that we have a next webinar coming up later this month, the 28th of May. John, you're going to be kind of taking us through this data topic in a slightly different context, data in the context of client insight. So I hope everyone can join John for that. We'll be sharing the registration for a link for that very soon. But thanks everyone for joining today, and thanks again, Ben, and John.